My name is John Moran. I'm originally from Philadelphia. When I was 18, started going to college at Tyler School of Art, which is actually where I started working with glass. Throughout the last 2 decades, I've traveled around and worked with glass in different studios and started developing my own techniques and developing my own kind of glass sculpting language that I could teach, but also bring into my work. And in 2013, I moved to Belgium, and I've been here in Ghent ever since. And in 2015, I started a studio here in Ghent called Ghent Glass, which is a public access glass studio focused on building a community around glass. My father died when I was 10, so I always kind of found myself distanced a lot of ways. And when I went to Tyler, I was actually kind of on the verge of stopping with art because I didn't really find my place. And when I found the glass studio, it was there's a community there. And that's one of the things that's really kept me in it also for the past 2 decades is the community of people around it. So my friends, the people I work with, my girlfriend, they're glass makers. And it's something that we all have this kind of passion together. So even though it's not always easy to find support, the community is really pretty amazing about supporting each other. And that's one of the things that has always driven me in my own interests in my own work, but also about being a glassmaker, that I want other people who would need this community to also be able to find it, because it was something that really gave me support when I needed it in my life, and I didn't know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And now I'm 20 years later still working with glass. Never really thought I would have a glass studio or start a glass studio, and it's just the way that the things went. It was something that needed to be there, and it makes sense, and I'm really happy that these things have gone the way that they've gone. I put this exhibition together. It's the first exhibition in the studio. We actually built this room for this exhibition, and then I hope to do more here in the future. But this exhibition is part of Habatat Galleries' Not Grandma's Glass exhibition series. And the show is called Hope Less and Disobey. And all of the work, with the exception of 2 pieces, was actually made during the lockdown of Corona. Most of my work has always been about social, political situations and critiquing them, or bringing a conversation to them. And it's something I think about a lot, kind of consistently, is that there's always these kind of 2 opposing sides, and we don't really find our way to meet in the middle. And that's something, even though I'm critical of a lot of things in the system, it's something that I'm constantly thinking about in my work, is how to find a middle ground between 2 completely polar opposite ideas. A lot of new work, so pretty much every piece that's been made, they kind of span through the different types of work that I've been making. So there's this really kind of realistic figurative pieces, which is the thing that I've kind of developed as a glass sculptor, trying to find as realistic a way of sculpting the human figure as possible, but then taking elements of that and bringing them into kind of a full sculpture. So in all of the pieces that you see here, the fleshy parts, the body parts, are all freehand sculpted glass, and then they're pieced together with a metal armature. And then I make the clothing out of textile and acrylic resin. And then the other components are also made from cast acrylic or components of a lot of different materials. So even though I find myself in the glass world, I work in the glass world, and I really am inspired by the community. I also work with a lot of materials. The main theme of this show, I think, so it hinges on a lot of ideas, immigration is a big part of it, this idea of isolation. But what every piece is actually really dealing with is this kind of oscillation between reality and a fantasy, a perceived reality, something that we think is going to be a certain way, and then as we experience it, it's in another way. And that's something for me that I really also think about a lot. when I left the US, I was coming to Belgium, and it was kind of like, everything is so great here. There's this great healthcare system. There's so many things that I really love about it. And then after being here for some time, you start to find the things that you also don't like about it. And then you go from this kind of like honeymoon period of living somewhere to it being real life. And then now that I'm here and I look back on the States, I have this also same kind of perception of the things that I miss. But I know that there's a reality to those things too. But with every step of this, you have this kind of going back and forth between what's real and what's not. It's also all about our own perception. How we see something that's happening is not the same way that someone else experiences it. There's not really a specific piece that this come to life in directly, but it really translates into the Mickey Morey skulls. Those pieces were really taken from the kind of period of isolation. They were a collaboration between my partner and I, Marta Berdziak. She did all the engraving and all of the pieces, but all of the imagery in the engraving is in reference to either things happening during Corona or the news stories we were reading about, and specifically finding this imagery with this kind of fake golden, like these fake gold pieces. So they're really intentionally fake, but supposed to look very luxurious. The piece called Travelore, and it was the title is like Traveler, but wordplay. So it's like the myth of travel. And especially this past year, both of us are immigrants here. We haven't gone to our families. We haven't gone out of Ghent. We haven't seen a lot of our friends, and started thinking about this concept and this idea within the isolation. So this Mickey Morey skull is actually kind of a globe, but in the globe, all of the countries are in the wrong place and of the wrong scale. And that was one of the things that we started talking about a little bit, is like how the more self-centered people become as a society, the more unaware they become of the things around them. So the point of that whole misguided or misaligned globe was to kind of show that there is so much focus on our own world and what makes our own living situation, our own country, this kind of nationalism that's growing now in almost everywhere, that it actually makes people very ignorant to the rest of the world. And that was the kind of concept behind the piece, but we also then brought in the flat earth map in it, because it's, there's not much to say about how the flat earth society exists, but the fact that that can exist now, I think says a lot about this kind of loss of, really like a loss of your sense of self and in a place, or your loss of understanding of the world outside of your own viewpoints. When I start these pieces, I have to kind of have a pretty solid idea in mind usually, because in order to make the pieces actually function as a sculpture, I have to really plan out the figurative parts and how they'll come together. But that being said, I also go into things pretty blindly. Like I have this idea about what the piece is about. I know I want to reference this sculpture, and I know I want to make the actual figure. So there's like, the figure, the body, the pose is in my head. And when I start piecing it together, because it works in components, like I have an arm and a head and another arm, and I have to fit them together. In that process, often it brings another idea. So like something specifically during a lot of the work in the show, because I didn't have the glass studio, I had parts made in the glass studio, but I didn't have access to the studio as much. There's a lot of mixed media that I probably wouldn't have use the material in the same way, because I had time during those 3 months to, when we were in lockdown, to play with rubber molds and take molds of things on the street and take molds of like these picture frames, and actually like the sword in the kid's hand. It's from a rubber mold, and then I cast acrylic into it. And then once I started to feel like I was comfortable with that, I started pushing that. So some of the things I think I wouldn't, if I had made this piece without this time, it would have been very different. So it does evolve as I'm going. And constantly I have this vision in my head of what I want it to be, but it's really the overall picture. And then there's all these details, and the details are where the idea really starts to come through for me and come to life. And that's what always gives the pieces their like poignancy for me, or like what brings them really to life. And those parts really always happen during the process. They're not something that I go in with a plan. Usually it comes in when I get to a point of like almost frustration with the piece that I don't know what I'm doing next, and then it all kind of comes together pretty quickly. So that's a really, it's a nice feeling in that way, but it's a really sometimes a stressful way of working in the way of putting these sculptures together. But I think a lot of that on-the-fly thinking, even though I have to plan very meticulously to get things to work, I also think on the fly, and a lot of that is related to working with glass. With glass, you have to prepare and have a kind of an idea going into it, but you're always reacting as well. So it's a bit different for me, like the way that my process of reaction isn't so much necessarily a material reaction, but it's a reaction during the process of making something. So these ideas are always there in my head, but how they're going to come through, it happens during the process. Specifically, this piece, Pray for Our Sinners, which is based on Donatello's David, was also about thinking about, it was in my mind a lot about this being isolated and how it affects people. And one of the things I was reading during this period was how this was having, the isolation was having such a terrible effect on abused people because they were basically locked in with their abusers. So that really inspired this piece to come to life. It's a piece I had been working on for quite a while already. I had this idea of using Donatello's David because in this sculpture, it's a teenage David, and he's naked and he's quite sexualized. And it always struck me as like an odd sculpture. It's a very beautiful sculpture, but it's also quite a sexualized figure who's also supposed to be kind of triumphant over Goliath. But that was the idea behind this piece. There's so much history of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And one of the things I wanted to take was to show this David who was also triumphing over these molesting priests. So in this piece, he's really standing on this deflated snake. It's supposed to look like a birthday balloon, and it's a deflated idea of sin and what original sin is. And he's wearing a schoolboy uniform, and that's based on my Catholic school uniform when I was a kid growing up. And in his left hand, he's holding a stuffed lamb, so like a toy lamb, but that lamb's throat is slit and there's blood coming from it. And the lamb is a symbol for Jesus and the Lamb of God. It's kind of a known symbol. But then in his other hand, he's also holding a flaccid and golden sword. And the sword looks like it's dripping and kind of seminal, even though it's really a soft, it's like a piercing tool, but it's gone soft and has lost its power. So that's kind of the symbols of this piece that all came from this period, but bring this, all of these ideas that I've been working with for kind of a long time, coming out in a very different way. There's a piece called Crying with Silent Lips. And Crying with Silent Lips, the title also comes from the poem about the Statue of Liberty. This piece is also about the idea of breaking through this fantasy wall of what it means to immigrate somewhere. One of the things that I've heard a lot of people say is like, yeah, well, you moved to Belgium because it's better here. And there's things that are better, but the idea that one place is superior to another is something that's very untrue in a lot of ways. And I was thinking about that a lot. Like, if someone leaves their home because they are fleeing from their home, and then someone confronts them with saying like, it's better here, how much of an emotional toll that takes over time. And that also kind of sets a longer term adaptation for people. Like, it's harder to assimilate, it's harder to become a part of the culture because you still aren't connecting to the new place and you're still missing your home place. So I used the Fountain of Apollo from the Palace of Versailles as like a base idea for this piece. And these kind of Disney princess horses are breaking out of these waves that are made from Disney castle bricks. But the whole idea is also pulling from the colonial history that a lot of Europe has, but that was pretty much illustrated in the Palace of Versailles, and how much this idea of going somewhere, taking over a land, and then offering them a citizenship or something in your land and convincing people that it's better, and then closing your borders to keep out immigrants in a situation when they need help. This whole kind of concept built into this piece. There's so many layers in it for me that it really, it really sticks, because it's something I kind of think about on a daily basis, or I'm really, again, like I said, a lot trying to come to terms with, and trying to understand how we can get to this position in society and be so unaware of like the history that has caused some of these situations. Not to critique it, but to understand it. The Crossing is another piece that's it's also very heavily influenced by immigration, or like not just immigration, but like the fleeing of one's country to go to another country. This piece is also a collaboration with Marta Berdziak, and she has done all the engraving on the piece, and together we worked on the concept. But the piece is really initially based on the father and his son who was crossing, I think it's the Rio Grande, from into the U.S. from Mexico, and drowned. And there was a photo of this drowned father and his baby son under his shirt, and that's what kind of inspired the piece. And this Mickey skull has become kind of like a character. This Mickey Mori has become a character that's starting to exist in this artistic world that I talked about, and he's becoming an element of like, also almost like an element of other cultures. Like he's a kind of surrogate for a figure or an idea, but a reminder that that there's still all these terrible things that are happening, and we can be very unaware of it because we're easily entertained. But in this piece, these images in the skull that are based on like ideas of illegal immigration. So there's images of the wall that Trump was building, of farming areas, of bullets, the idea like of guns and bullets, and kind of playing with or pushing, using images that people perceive to be what happens with illegal immigration, or illegal quote-unquote immigration, and what there is of reality to it. And in the baby figure, there's also just referencing images of childhood. So there's like a little clock that has its face in the clock, and he has a little pacifier in his mouth, and also a fence image that's kind of based on the cages that kids were put in on the border between the States and Mexico. And the two pieces are in a golden frame on the ground that is also meant to look like it's in a puddle of water. So it's a reference to a lot of this idea, but also pulling in this religious imagery. This frame is mimicking a Virgin Mary with child, and the water being like the symbol for life, supposed to be like a symbol for life, but we also know that these people drowned in the water, so it has this dual layering. Mirror Mirror is also a collaboration with Marta Berdziak. She has done the engraving on the skull, and conceptually we collaborated on the entire idea. But these skulls are also intentionally kind of using the colors from like the Delft blue, like the Delft blue from the Dutch ceramics. And so the blue and white is a really important color choice. But this skull we made really at the beginning of the lockdown. We had the skull components, but the imagery started to come during the first wave of corona. And this skull has like fingerprints on it and teeth marks from a little kid, so like how the disease was spreading. But the skull itself was wearing a mask, and then around the figure of the skull, there's a bunch of figures without masks and an image of the corona skull itself. But this, again, golden mirror is intentionally kind of shaped like a coffin. And in the reflection, as the Mickey is looking, or the skull is looking into the reflection, you see yourself in this fingerprint shadow that he has. So it's supposed to really create like a little bit of a visual confusion. And it was something that we were, again, I touched on before, but like that we were stuck in of how many people were not believing that this was a real thing, especially in the beginning, and how not serious a lot of places were taking what this year has turned out to be. And the contradiction between that you can kind of blindly have faith in one invisible thing and not believe in another invisible thing. And that was something really, that really came out in this piece for us. It was really, really important to the whole concept of the work, but also how it built into the other pieces. So like really pulling these golden elements that are in these pieces, they relate back to the idea of Versailles and the golden sword in this kid's hand, and the idea of the stained glass windows, the fake stained glass windows. All of these are ideas of wealth. All of these are ideas of affluence or fake affluence, and somewhat of a superiority almost, but false superiority. And to pull this imagery of wealth in contrast with these kind of terrible imageries was also part of this idea of like breaking down perception and reality. So using the stained glass window and referencing church windows is important to connect to all of the pieces that are there, because there's a lot of religious imagery as well in all of the works. And in, for instance, the mirror piece, you see that he has little crosses carved around him because they were people who were trying to pray the disease away. And also at one point there was the talk that it was 5G coming from China, so Bill Gates could give us all chips. I mean, at some point it became so crazy to me that it was like, or to us, I guess, when we were building it, that it was hard to find again like ourselves and where we were in this place that we were living in, or the reality that we were living in. One of the first pieces that started to really kind of play with this idea of really pushing the idea of perception. The figure itself is based on the story of a little girl whose brother was killed by the police, shot for partying basically, and the little girl told in this interview that I saw was that the only way she thinks of her brother now is being shot by the police. And that really kind of, it touched me, and it was one of the things that started this idea that like, no matter what, this is her childhood, no matter what she ever, like to come out of that takes a lot. I don't want to say that it's impossible to come out of it, but the way that she said at that time was, the only way I see my brother is this way. And then again, to have on the other side people say, if you dream it, it will come true, but that's not something that is true for everybody. So this piece is intentionally kind of made to look like one of the sculptures that hangs like on a wall, like a bust for the saints in the church. But in the piece, she's actually offering her hand, but the idea was that she was offering a wish. But the way that she's been perceived sometimes is that she's begging. And it's not the intention of the piece, but that's the intention, like that illustrates the idea of how people perceive things, that because it's a figure of color, initially or almost immediately people see her as a beggar, white people especially in And it's really something that stands out in a strange way to me, that it's not the intent of the piece at all, but how that became such like an impactful like idea. Like it disgusted me in a lot of ways that happened that way, and it made me really want to try to change the way that I was putting work out there so that wouldn't happen, so it couldn't be confused in the wrong way. But it's still like, I think it's a powerful piece, and the gaze that she has, the way that she's looking. I do like to, or hope to, try to think for like the better of humanity, that people saw that in her, that she was hurt and longing, and that's why they wanted to try to help by thinking she was begging and putting coins in her hand, but that was not the intention. But I still find that piece to be really connected with the whole concept of the exhibition, and how she is like the starting point for a lot of the ideas. So the piece, When a Butterfly Flaps Its Wings, it's part of a kind of a new series that I've been doing recently, which is digital collage printed on glass. And it's kind of referencing historical paintings and playfully referencing stained glass, but in the most artificial way that I could think of doing it, that it would be really not stained glass and intentionally not that, but having this reference to it. And in one of the pieces, there's a praying Mary, and in the background there's a landscape of Ghent, and then the Berlin Wall, and the Mary has a string around her finger that she's trying to control this butterfly. And this whole piece is about this breakdown of reality, or breakdown of your perception of reality. When I first moved to Ghent, there was a very, like I said earlier, or I said before, there was a very feeling that everything is really amazing here. It's such a beautiful place. And then I went through a divorce. I had a lot of problems, like a lot of things happened with my personal life. And that also completely shifted my perception to that everything was terrible here and I hated it. And now it's balancing out again because I've made peace with my divorce. I've found another way of working with people or with friends. I've met someone, and it's brought it to another level. So this idea that you always are living in flux with your perception of what's happening is there specifically. And then having the Berlin Wall as a symbol for me really specifically of two polarizing ideas, and how when the wall collapses, you really see what's on the other side. But in this piece too, this Mary is actually holding a butterfly, and the butterfly is a reference to the kind of chaos theory that when a butterfly flaps its wings, it causes a storm. But the Mary's praying, and she's also trying to control this butterfly with a string, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek to say that you can pray for things to be great, but it doesn't make them great. It's something I heard a lot when I was growing up, that somebody would pray for me, and that's why I have something that I had, was because people prayed for me. But in reality, a lot of it was because I was really working hard, and a lot of people go through this too. In 2018, Susan came, and we had the opportunity to work together in Ghent. And it was a really great experience, and we had a really nice time working together. And we made this chandelier, kind of pulling elements from both of our work. We knew we wanted to do a hanging sculpture, and as we were talking over what the concept would be, I had brought up that what was happening at the time, and is still happening, but was very prevalent, was the Syrian refugee crisis. And it's still ongoing. People are still dying daily. But at that point, we wanted to reference that and bring something to it. So this piece was made to be a kind of a guiding light. So there's the sun that's referencing, visually it's referencing kind of these Baroque sculptures and some of the pieces from St. Barbara's Cathedral, but it's also like a dim light above this figure that's like one of the kids who passed away, but is guiding through the rain with a dim light of sun, and then he's holding a lantern, and the lantern has these wave patterns in it that Susan put together that was kind of referencing the sea and the rough sea. So he's really supposed to be like a guiding light for people crossing, and that piece still, it's because it's also like both of our ideas coming together that really still kind of touches me. And in the clothing also, we used the references to what I was talking about earlier, the make these works. It's not that I'm trying to illustrate what's messed up or what's bad. It's that I'm also trying to kind of come to terms with it. It's like, this is really pretty terrible situation, and I can't fathom how someone can do that. So in making these works, it's also like putting these things, like trying to understand how things can be so shit. I really don't know how it can go like that bad in a situation. So that piece is also really, I don't know, it's important for me, or it still grabs me because it makes me think about when I was growing up. One of our friends committed suicide, and we never really found out what happened or why. We thought he was playing with a gun, we didn't really know the reason of what happened, or we still don't. But sometimes when we've talked to some of my childhood friends, like, we wondered if he had been molested, because at one point, one of the priests who was at the church that we went to was, he had to leave under strange circumstances. And knowing all the cover-ups that have happened in the past with the church, it's something that we started questioning at a point. So that piece really hits home, or it hits like a nerve, because it's something that we experienced in maybe not as a horrific way as other people have, but like, it was a real thing. It was something we think about still. And to know that there's people that have to think about this because they're confronted with it every day because it happened to them, it's a terrible situation. And I can't see how something that's supposed to be a position of power and be something that would help people can also have such a terrible side to it. So it really grabs me, that piece. When people come to see these pieces, like, I don't want them to have I don't want them to come away with my viewpoints. I want them to see these pieces and then question their own perspective or their own situation, and try to maybe not to just offer critique. That's not the idea, but to set up a situation where people are like pushed to think or to question their own perceptions of what's happening. The work is intentionally set up as a narrative so that it tells a story, and the story isn't necessarily A to B to C, but there's a story in every work, and those stories are in a lot of ways illustrative, and they bring they're based on very specific narratives in my way of making the work, but I don't expect that people take those narratives and understand them. But I do think that they build a narrative. I hope that they build a narrative, and they start to question or think about the things that the work is about. It's something that drives me. It's part of what I believe in a way that I think it's something that we should constantly evaluate as a person and as a society and as an individual, and as a species, as we're evolving. It should be part of our steps. Not only how can we succeed, but how can we take care of each other, and how we understand each other, and how we communicate with each other, and don't just continue to go through points of war and fights and battles and arguing over whose perception is better than the other, whose belief is more real and whose belief is less real. I think that's the question that I hope people ask when they walk out.